Hello, everyone. This is Gene Geog History, and last time I made a video of the groups that are mixed with Sub-Saharan African and West Eurasian, otherwise known as mulatto groups based on recent admixture and ancient admixture. And today's video is going to have me do the same thing, but with Wasian groups. So these are groups that are mixed with West Eurasian and East Eurasian, whether that admixture is from recent, i.e., less than 500 years ago, or ancient, more than 500 years ago. By East Eurasian, I am referring to East Asia, Southeast Asia, and to be honest, even Oceania. While West Eurasia, I am considering Europe, West Asia and South Asia kind of as well, but parts of South Asia. So that those are the definitions of the two groups. S- The first group that I'm going to focus on are the recently unmixed groups. So this comes from within the last 500 years, which is mostly due to trade, colonization, labor migration, or diaspora formation outside of the countries. So that's kind of where I'm coming from when it comes to recently admixed groups. And I'm focusing on groups, not specific individuals, if that makes sense. The first region I'm going to focus on is Southeast Asia. So this is whether it's the colonial area or migration era Eurasian groups. So with the Philippines, we have two that kind of fit into this. One is obviously colonial era, and the second is migration era focused. So the first group is the Mestizo Filipino. So this is essentially a Spanish slash Filipino mix. So obviously, since the Philippines was colonized by Spain, there was definitely a decent amount of procreation regarding Spaniard men and the Filipino women, which caused for this mestizo group. And it's not the mestizo that we know in North America, where that is indigenous Indian and Spaniard. But in the Philippines, these are Spaniard and Filipino mix. So the West Eurasian plus Austronesian slash East Asian. This is an ancient group that kind of just continued on and on and on and on while the colonial era continued and eventually ended. And this second group mainly comes from migration era merging. So essentially more recent, and these are people either coming to the Philippines and merging, or mainly people leaving the Philippines and merging outside. So these include Eurasian Filipino Americans, so Asian Americans essentially from the Philippines. They either migrate to the UK or the US, and then they procreate with a white person, hence the half Filipino Asian American. And it's pretty much the same thing with other Eurasian diaspora mixed groups. So Asian, Filipino, UK people, Asian, Filipino, Australian people, Asian, Filipino, Canadian, stuff like that. So you kind of catch my points. And the other mixture doesn't really matter as long as it's West Eurasian, mainly European. Now I'm going to move on to other Asian, Southeast Asian groups. So there's the Eurasians of Malacca, Kristang, and this is a mix of Portuguese and Malaysian. So a very interesting mix there. Then we have the Dutch Indonesians, or the Indos as they're otherwise known. And this is pretty much a mix of Dutch plus Javanese slash Sudanese slash etc. And I do think there's some people in this mix in Suriname, if I'm remembering this correctly as well. There's also the Anglo-Burmese, Anglo-Malay, and Anglo-Singaporean. So these are essentially people who are half British and half Burmese, half Malaysian, half Singaporean. So this comes from the British plus local Southeast Asian groups mixing and merging. So it's pretty self-explanatory there. Then there are the Thai Eurasians, which emerged mostly in the last century. So these are people who are half Thai, i.e., from Thailand, and half white. It could be a mix of European or white North American, but pretty much people who are half Thai and half white. Now we are going to focus on East Asia or Northeast Asia, depending on which term you want to use. And these groups are mainly modern diaspora mixtures, as they are individual level ethnic communities rather than ethnically consolidated populations. So the first group are Hapa slash Hathu. So these are people who are half Japanese and half European or American. So essentially, half Japanese, half white people. There are select communities in Japan, and of course, there are diasporas like Wasian Japanese Americans, Wasian Japanese Australians, Wasian Japanese Canadians, Wasian Japanese UK people, so on and so forth. So for Korea, we have the Han Heo population, or that's the term that they use for this admixture. I'm sure I mispronounced the term, so I do apologize for that. So essentially, this admixture are people who are Korean and white. It could be white European, white American, or white Australian, or whatever. But essentially, they are half Korean and half white. Then the final group representing East Asians are Chinese Western mixed diaspora. So these are people who are Han Chinese plus European slash Middle Eastern, so half Han Chinese and half white. Due to China having the biggest population in East and Southeast Asia, I'm sure their mixed Asian counterparts are the largest Asian populations, just based on that. Don't really have anything else to say, so we're just going to move on. Now I'm going to talk about Central slash Northern Asia, mainly with Russia and Siberia. So there is the Russian native Siberian mixed populations, like the Yakuts slash Sakha plus Russian, or the Evenki plus Russian groups. Some of these are modern mixes, while others have more deeper, closer to more ancient roots. So just from what I can guess here, this mix is from the European Russian and the Mongolian or Siberian Russian, if that kind of makes sense. And it's pretty much the same thing with the Russo Kazakh or Russo Mongolian mixed families, though with those latter two, they're mainly Central Asian mixed with the white Russian, though there might be some admixture within the Kazakh and the Mongolian as well, which we'll get into soon. So I do want to briefly touch upon Oceania. So they're technically not Asian, but they are descendants of East Asians, and they are similar within that cluster. But there are many mixed with European Oceanians, as there's parts European Polynesian, so like the Maori European mix, the Tahitian French mix, and those are modern. There's also the Chamorro Guamin Eurasians, Spanish American plus Chamorro, and mixtures, or just people who are just half white and half Polynesian or Melanesian. It's pretty simplistic, honestly. Alrighty, so we covered the recently admixed Eurasian, East Eurasian, and West Eurasian groups, and now we're going to do the anciently admixed East Eurasian and West Eurasian groups, or otherwise known as Eurasian groups. So these groups have the same admixture of both East Eurasian and West Eurasian, but the admixture is very old, like older than 500 years, so it's ancient. So that makes the difference between this group and the group I just covered. So the biggest ancient group with this admixture is pretty self-explanatory, and this is Central Asian, so the largest ancient East and West Eurasian zone. And just based off of where it's located, it makes sense because it's literally in the middle of Europe/West Asia and East Asia. So most Central Asian people descend from ancient mixtures of West Eurasian steppe groups and East Eurasian groups. So essentially, the groups of people that fit into this category are mainly Turkic speaking Central Asian, so like the Kazakh, the Kyrgyz, the Uzbeks, the Turkmens, though they're a bit more West Eurasian than other Turkics. The Uyghurs, who have substantial ancient West and East Eurasian admixture, the Tatars, and the Baskiers. So there are also the Mongolic speaking groups. So the biggest examples are Mongolians, who are anciently mixed with West Eurasian steppe ancestry, the Buryats, and the Kalmyks, who have Mongolic plus European admixture from long historical ties. So pretty much, I'm assuming the Mongolic speaking groups have more East Eurasian ancestry in comparison, while the Turkic speaking Central Asians are either right in the middle or a bit more West Eurasian lengths. But essentially, this is from the steppe group mixing with the East Eurasians, and it's why they have a similar look to modern Wasians today. Now we are going to briefly talk about Siberian people and their ancient mixture shows that they have ancient North Eurasian DNA, which is actually pretty closely related to West Eurasians. So that's where they get a lot of that admixture from, in addition to early East Asian lineages. And I guess it makes sense why this would happen because Siberia is mainly in northern Asia. So if you're getting parts from West Eurasia and East Eurasia, you're going to have that mix, even though the ancient North Eurasian element essentially comes from West Eurasia. So groups with this ancient blend is the Yakut slash Saka people, the Evenki slash Even slash Tungusic people, the Ninets slash Nanganasan people. They have a varying degree of ancient Northeast versus East Asian admixture, the Chucky, Koryak people, the Atilman people, and the Ket people. And I'm sure I mispronounced most of them, and I do apologize for that. So this next group is pretty interesting, and they are South Asians who are Indo-Aryan and Dravidian speaking, or they are those populations. So pretty much South Asia is a major ancient fusion zone between West Eurasian related ancestry. So these are Iranian farmers, steppe Indo-Europeans, and the second group that is a major ancient fusion is the AASI, which are ancient South Indian which have some distant ties to East Eurasian slash Australoid slash Redoid. So essentially, East Eurasia and Oceania, pretty much. So South Asia's a mix of those two, and it definitely makes sense just based off of where it's located in the southern middle part of Asia and Eurasia just overall. So modern South Asians are descendants from this ancient mix, though the amount of the mixture is pretty interesting. North Indians definitely have more West Eurasian, i.e., steppe, and Iranian admixture with more minor AASI admixture. South Indians definitely have more AASI ancestry with West Eurasian admixture, so they're probably the closest to the 50-50 ground, like Asians. Sri Lankans are very similar to South Indians, as they're probably the closest to 50-50, with more ancient South Indian DNA, i.e., more Australoid, Redoid. And then we have the Nepalese people, which is a very interesting group, as they're literally in the middle of India and China. And I'm mainly referring to the Indo-Aryan Nepalese people, as they are a mix of West Eurasian and Himalayan East Eurasian influences. So they have direct ties to East Eurasia or East Asia compared to the other South Asian groups. So the final group is easily the most ancient one, and there isn't much information on them in comparison, and that's the Anglo, where populations had blended ancestry of West Eurasian and East Eurasian. So examples are the Scythians and the Sarmatians, who had West Eurasian plus some East Eurasian elements, so it sounds like it's leaning more West Eurasian than East Eurasian. The Xianggu also had that same mixed lineage. The Hans are also heavily admixed in comparison to their highly admixed confederation. They're probably closer to the 50-50 as well as the Xianggu, probably. And the final group are the Tocharians, which is a Western Eurasian group that mixed with East Asians over time. So I went over the recently admixed groups and I went over the anciently admixed groups. So like in the last video, now I'm going to break down the populations that are the closest to the 50-50 balance from both ancient and recent groups. So what I'm trying to get at are the populations that are closest to a 50-50 mixture between West Eurasians and East Eurasians. And East Eurasians also include Austronesian, Australopapan, and AASI related ancestry. So when it comes to the recent admixed groups, so the ones that are closest to the 50-50 equilibrium between East and West Eurasians, we are going to break it down. So there are a lot of them that are roughly even, so I'm not going to point it out as a number one or a number two or anything like that. I'm just going to list them off. So we do have the group of Indos, or otherwise known as Dutch Indonesians, who are one of the most consistently 50-50 Eurasian groups, as they are on average 40 to 60% West Eurasian, i.e. Dutch, and 40 to 60% Austronesian slash Southeast Asian, so Indonesian, just generally. We then move on to the Kristang population, which is a Portuguese and Malay Eurasian mix, where they are roughly 45 to 55% West Eurasian in Portuguese, i.e., Portuguese, and 45 to 55% Malay. So, a fairly stable admixed population since the 1500s. So, we are going to move on to the Filipino mestizos, i.e., the Mestizo Filipinos, and they're not as close to the 50-50 equilibrium, though there are some examples that are right down the middle. But on average, they're between 35 to 50% European, i.e. Spanish, and 50 to 65% Indonesian slash East Asian, i.e. Filipino. So they tend to be more Filipino than average. So we're now going to move on to the Eurasian, Japanese slash Korean slash Chinese. So the Hapa slash Hongyeol slash Jeongsui, mispronounce my pronunciation, I apologize. And from here, it's not just focusing on the first generation Eurasians, but the ones where you go down several generations where the admixture isn't right down the middle. So on an individual level, not ethnic groups, but the averages ranges between 45 to 55% East Asian plus 45 to 55% European. So when it comes to the 50-50 equilibrium, it's very common in the first generation mixes. So at six are the Russo-Siberian mixed families and the modern examples. So these are the Yakut, Evenki, Tuxi plus Russian mixtures, often fall between the 45 to 55% East Eurasian plus 45 to 55% West Eurasian, i.e. Slavic. So that's the average bad mixture there. Alrighty, so now I do want to get into the ancient admixed populations that are closest to 50-50. So these populations formed thousands of years ago, but some have ancestry components that land near half West Eurasian and half East Eurasian. So we have the ancient Uyghur Tarim Basin from the Iron Age Tsingsang. Hopefully I said that correctly. So pretty much many Iron Age Tsingsang genomes are 45 to 55% West Eurasian, steppe slash Iran related, and 45 to 55% East Eurasian, Siberian slash East Asian. So these are among the closest ancient examples. Now we're going to move on to the Kazakhs. So they are obviously a modern population, but their admixture is ancient. So the average is 55% East Eurasian, so Turkic, Mongolic, Siberian, and 45% West Eurasian, so steppe Iranian slash Indo-European. So some subgroups reverse the ratio, but they are close to 50-50. We have here Gs who are about 50% West Eurasian, Iranian steppe, and 50% East Eurasian, Siberian. One of the most balanced modern Central Asian populations. So they are a modern Central Asian population, but their admixture is ancient. So it's pretty much the same for what I said regarding the northern Ujiers, which is a modern population, but their admixture is about 55% West Eurasian and 45% East Eurasian. So they're a bit more West Eurasian, but they are still pretty close to the 50-50 equilibrium. So we're going to move on to the Kalmyks. So these are the Oirat Mongols of Russia. So they have a 40 to 50% East Eurasian, admixtures are Mongolic, and 50 to 60% West Eurasian. So steppe, Caucasus, Russian. So they are a historically admixed group among or across the steppe. So we're moving on to some Turkic Siberian groups who have ancient admixture. So these are mainly the Tuvan and Khakas groups. So they are essentially 50-50, pretty much. So we're moving on to the Scythian populations, which come from the Iron Age steppe, where they have, especially the Eastern Scythians, have 50% West Eurasian, so Yemnyaya, Iranian farmer, plus 50% East Eurasian, i.e. Siberian. And the final group are the ancient Mongolian late Bronze Age groups, where many samples show 50% West Eurasian steppe and 50% East Asian. So they represent the early Turkic Mongolic formation mixtures. So that concludes my video on the genetically Wasian groups of recent and ancient admixture. I knew this video was going to have a decent amount of content because I knew that there was a lot of genetically Wasian populations. So the final video is going to be the genetically Malaysian populations of recent and ancient admixture. And I don't think this video or that video will have much to it because or at least just from my general knowledge, there isn't a whole lot of them, but it'll be interesting to compare and contrast the three different main admixture groups. So thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with more content soon. Bye.